Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. It is Wednesday. Major story of the day, of course, is the Washington Post report that the Justice Department is investigating Trump's actions in the January 6th criminal probe. That during the grand jury investigation, they have been focusing on Donald Trump, what Donald Trump said, what he did, what was going on in these meetings. Now, this all sounds very, very promising. And then, of course, we also had Attorney General Merrick Garland sitting down with NBC's Lester Holt, and this is what the Attorney General had to say last night.
Look, we pursue justice without fear or favor. We intend to hold anyone who is criminally responsible for the events surrounding January 6th, for any attempt to interfere with the lawful transfer of power from one administration to another, accountable. That's what we do. We don't pay any attention to other issues with respect to that.
Okay, so good, but I'm sorry to be the guy raising the caveat. On yesterday's podcast, we talked with Andrew Weissman, a former Department of Justice prosecutor, who said, look, this is all good. There's more than enough evidence to charge Donald Trump criminally, but the clock is running. And there's going to be tremendous political pressure on them. If you haven't listened to the podcast from yesterday, you ought to listen to our conversation, because I asked Andrew Weissman, I said, so what if they don't go forward with the charges? What if they decide it's too heavy a lift and Trump is returned to the presidency? What would Trump 2.0 look like? And Andrew Weissman said, I don't think I have enough alcohol at home to even fathom that. But we're getting more and more glimpses, again, of what Trump's ideas are for Trump 2.0. Now, there's been a lot of attention to the fact that the former disgraced president returned to the scene of the crime, came back to D.C. to speak to a group of adoring fans. And, because he didn't spend most of his time airing his grievances, some of the commentators in the punditocracy described Trump's remarks as a policy address. It was not a policy address because, folks, Donald Trump does not do policy. What he does, though, is play some of his greatest hits. And once again, he laid out kind of his American carnage dystopian view. Let's play a couple of these clips, including his deep enthusiasm for killing drug dealers. I mean, this, again, keep in mind that this is the pro-life president who is very enthusiastic over the prospect of quickly executing drug dealers, as they do. He doesn't name them by name, but as they do in places like China, the Philippines. This is what the president said about that.
And the penalties should be very, very severe. If you look at countries throughout the world, the ones that don't have a drug problem are those that institute a very quick trial, death penalty sentence for drug dealers. It sounds horrible, doesn't it? But you know what? That's the ones that don't have any problem. It doesn't take 15 years in court. It goes quickly, and you absolutely, you execute a drug dealer and you'll save 500 lives, because they kill on average 500 people.
Yeah, this is not something new from Donald Trump. By the way, I described him as the president. Obviously, he is the disgraced, defeated, twice impeached former president. This is not new for him. He's repeatedly praised the policies of countries like the Philippines, where the former president, Duterte, is estimated to have murdered more than 6,000 drug dealers in 1 year. And Donald Trump looks at that and goes, cool. That'd be great. Also, Trump went on to say that this was the American First Summit. He called for federal power to send the National Guard to restore order and to secure the peace without having to wait for the approval of some governor that thinks it's politically incorrect to call them in. The crowd loved that. This is the leader of the Party of States' Rights, basically saying, I want to be able to send these troops into these cities without worrying about what the local governor has to say. He also got big applause when he mocked, pretended to be a transgender weightlifter after a bit about not wanting transgendered athletes in women's sports. And so, there he is, with his little hands, trying to show what it would be like to, lift weights. Of course, Donald Trump, I don't think has ever lifted anything heavier than money. And then, and this has gotten a lot of attention, his one big policy was to call for massive tent cities. This is hard to not sound like it's a parody. That he is, besides the summary execution of drug dealers, he is proposing these massive internment camps for the homeless outside of cities. And clearly he wants to sound like he's given a great deal of thought to this policy to deal with the scourge of homelessness. Let's play that.
And then you look at the tents and the homeless, and you say, what's happening to this great bastion? Perhaps some people will not like hearing this, but the only way you're going to remove the hundreds of thousands of people, and maybe throughout our nation, millions of people we're talking about, and help make our cities clean, safe, and beautiful again, is open up large parcels of inexpensive land in the outer reaches of the cities, bring medical professionals, including doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, drug rehab specialists, build permanent bathrooms and other facilities, make them good, make them hard, but build them fast, and create thousands and thousands of high-quality tents, which can be done in one day. And you have to move people out. Now, some people say, oh, that's so horrible. No, what's horrible is what's happening now. Because now they're in tents, but most of them aren't even tents that function.
So he didn't explain how he would get these people out, what the removal process would be, whether it would be voluntary, whether it would be involuntary. He also didn't explain how this would necessarily, quote unquote, solve the problem other than to round up millions of people and presumably with some sort of compulsion, forcibly have them sent to these camps, which would have permanent bathrooms, but obviously temporary tents. So I guess, this is where it's like, what exactly is the policy here other than more Trumpy, more sort of Trumpy, irritable gestures? And look, really, what says American greatness more than massive internment camps for homeless people, executions of drug dealers, border walls, federal troops in the city's coups, and the mockery of sexual minorities. Am I right? And of course, the crowd was eating it up and is anxious to put Donald Trump back in the White House. Well, on the same theme, this is taking place, of course, in the midst of these January 6th hearings, which are not done yet. I thought it was interesting watching all the Republican politicians trooping to be the opening acts for Trump's appearance yesterday. You would never know from Kevin McCarthy's appearance or his comments that the nation is learning about what Donald Trump did and did not do surrounding the criminal conspiracy to overthrow the presidential election. But on today's show, we're going to look at the January 6th hearings, and we're going to look at it through the lens of the January 6th hearings as compelling reality TV shows, which again looks at it through the lens that Donald Trump might look at those hearings. As you probably know, losing weight is impossible when you can't control those cravings throughout the day. Salty snacks or sweet treats are always within reach. What about the temptation at all of those summer barbecues? Well, the new weight control formula from Nusu Labs uses biohacking technology to curb your appetite and control those unwanted cravings. Formulated with natural ingredients and antioxidants, this new weight control formula helps you maximize a healthy metabolism and keeps you away from all of those empty calories safely, naturally, and without the harmful side effects of restrictive diets and supplements. And this one-of-a-kind formula has the mood-enhancing ingredient that you find in dark chocolate to keep you from getting hangry. Nusu guarantees that you will lose up to 3 pounds in the first week, and it's guaranteed or your money back. And right now, you get a free bottle with your order. That's nusulabs.com/bulwark, nusulabs.com/bulwark. Join Nusu's world-class concierge program for an extra 10% off at checkout. Free monthly supply, free priority shipping. That's nusulabs.com/bulwark, NUSU Labs, nusulabs.com/bulwark. These statements and products have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or condition. These statements and information are not a substitute for or alternative to seeking care from your healthcare providers.
Hey, 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 BA fam. It's Tiffany and Mandy from the Brown and Bitch podcast, and we have some exciting news for you. For the first time ever, we are going live on YouTube. When?
Head to www.youtube.com/Cumulus podcast at noon Eastern on July 28th to join us, Brown Ambition, live.
If you haven't heard, July 28th is when we get our first clues as to whether or not we are really in a recession. And who better to break it all down than your personal financial sisters?
If you have a question about the recession, we got your back. The Brown Ambition live recession reaction show, Thursday, July 28th, noon Eastern on YouTube, and everywhere you get your podcasts after that.
I'm really looking forward to talking with today's guest. James Poniewozik wrote one of the definitive books early on in the Trump administration, Audience of One, Donald Trump Television, and the Fracturing of America. James, welcome back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Charlie.
James is the chief television critic for the New York Times. And I remember you and I talked about your book at the time, which I thought was one of the most insightful takes about the media landscape and the way that Donald Trump is really a creature of it, and also I hate to say the word master practitioner, but you really can't understand Donald Trump without seeing him through the lens of a political culture that is shaped and often dominated by television.
Absolutely. I mean, he was a media celebrity before he was a politician. He was really a media celebrity before he was a businessman. And, you don't get that big without being good at using the media in some way.
So, last night I was on one of the cable shows and was asked about the whether or not there was a shift in the conservative media coverage of Donald Trump in the wake of the January 6th hearings, and of course, the Exhibit A and B. Wall Street Journal editorial ripping Donald Trump, the New York Post breaking bad on Donald Trump, other print publications on the right breaking bad on Donald Trump. And I guess my main caveat was it's one thing for right-wing print publications to break bad on Donald Trump, but things are not really going to change until you see that trickle down into Fox News prime time and the other outlets that Donald Trump has weaponized so effectively over the years. Do you agree with that? I mean, how do you parse out what's going on right now? Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal, Rupert Murdoch's New York Post, breaking seriously bad against Donald Trump. But I'm not seeing that really in the world dominated by Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, and Laura Ingraham. What do you think?
No, yeah, I'm pretty much with you on that. I mean, Fox News is still the front of the shop there. It's going to get attention from political pundits and other journalists if the New York Post editorial page turns on Trump. But it's really going to make a difference if you start seeing that in Fox primetime. And I think that Fox, like any TV network, it's led by its viewership. It's led by its viewership as much as it leads its viewership.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there has just got to be this constant. As you saw when Fox changed toward Trump over the course of the 2016 primary, this kind of constant monitoring of the feedback loop to see kind of where the audience is on it now. I think if you look at Fox and its position toward kind of Republican politics right now, maybe you could argue that they've gone in much more on Ron DeSantis over the past year, so maybe that is more of a bets hedging move, but it's going to be a much huger deal if somebody in Fox primetime, casts a slightly negative light on Donald Trump, much less, suggests that Joe Biden won the 2020 election than if the Wall Street Journal editorial board does.
This seems like a crucial point. The distinction you're making here is that outlets like Fox are really driven by their audience, that it's bottom up rather than having the content dictated from on high. There's a certain audience capture that takes place in the media. Is that true?
Yeah, I think it's a feedback loop. I think that, Fox is not powerless in this. I mean, I think Rupert Murdoch's thing in journalism has long been, kind of give the people what they want, and the most red meat version of that. And that's been very successful with it. But that also comes, with a certain risk that, your audience kind of just evolves out of your control, or that there is a danger in crossing them. So I certainly think that, particularly once we saw again in the 2016 primary, that there was only so much that, quote unquote, elite conservative media opinion could do to move the conservative electorate. I think there was a lesson learned that the tail was wagging the dog or the dog is driving the car, which crazy metaphor that I'm looking for. But that basically, to some extent, the audience programs Fox.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about the piece that you wrote about the January 6th hearings. You wrote a column in the Times describing the hearings as water cooler TV, and I thought your analysis was really interesting because, I mean, before they started, I think there was a lot of skepticism about whether these hearings would make any difference whatsoever. And, as you point out, investigating a threat to democracy was always going to be important, but it wasn't clear that it was going to be buzzworthy. But you wrote, this time it did manage to be buzzworthy. It became water cooler TV. So walk me through that. How did that happen? How did a congressional committee, I mean, look, these things are usually complete, clown car clusterfucks of boredom. And yet they did manage to become compelling television. So walk me through how those January 6th committees became what you called water cooler TV.
I mean, first of all, there was the decision up front that, yeah, this is a television event and we're going to make it as television. And a former president of ABC News with a lot of experience in producing nonfiction and documentary television was brought in to work on this and oversee it. And one of the first things that they decided is, yeah, we're gonna chuck the talk.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be 11 hours of going round robin around the committee and everybody takes 5 minutes to ask questions or grandstand. And you watch somebody lean into a microphone and drink water for 5 hours or whatever. It's a medium, and again, like, this does not need to mean dumbing anything down or reducing your ambitions. But you were deciding that that you were realizing you're telling this story through a medium that tells its story largely through image, and so graphics are very important. Video clips are very important. You need to kind of craft a narrative that people can follow and pick up and get through and know where they are and know where they're going. And so structure was also very important. I found it very interesting that, in a way, the committee had sort of some of the same challenges that somebody telling, a serial story in scripted or streaming TV or whatever does, right? Don't get the audience lost.
Right.
If somebody has just dropped in or they haven't watched in a while, you got to give them a previously on, and here's what's coming up. And they were literally doing that sort of thing in the form of kind of recapping where we've been up to this point in some of the introductions, and giving people guideposts going forward to where they were going to be going in the rest of the sessions.
I thought it was interesting the way you compared it to sort of the structure of TV miniseries, how they will, dive into the middle of things. They will create storylines. They will create characters. You have the surprise witnesses. it actually had that kind of rhythm. I mean, there were some missteps, there were some, I mean, it wasn't uniformly excellent,
Yeah.
but, as you point out, the odds were so strongly against this. I mean, maybe let's go back a little bit. People are jaded, they're exhausted. There's all kinds of studies showing that people are bailing out of the media. I mean, ratings for television are down. I mean, obviously, you have MAGA World, which is hermetically sealed off from having to confront any of these things. And yet, looking back on the 8 or 9 sessions, they succeeded in drawing an audience for public affairs television. They got other witnesses to come forward. You have some polls suggesting they might have moved a little bit of opinion on Trump, and it was watchable.
Yeah.
So, in part, it was because they used the graphics, they used the clips, they used those 3D models of the executive dining room at the White House. I mean, was there any moment where you sat back and went, "Gosh, these guys really are getting how you construct a television narrative"? Was there some moment?
Yeah.
I think it was when I started seeing the 3D models. I thought, okay, these guys, this is interesting. This is next level stuff.
That was certainly a thing for me, which they used early on. And with Cassidy Hutchinson, when she gave her testimony, you're seeing here's how far she is down the hall. It's like putting you in the room. Here's how far it's visually stating here's how close this person is to power. And I almost felt like, bear with me here for this crazy analogy, but you watch Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
So every episode of Game of Thrones opens with these credits where there's a map of Westeros and you come zooming in and there's a model of Winterfell and King's Landing. And it looks really cool, but it performs a function. Game of Thrones is this complex, sprawling narrative, and it is helping situate you in space in this complex story. So you have a sense of here's how far, this thing that's going on with this character is from that one. TV audiences often need that. And it was very interesting to see a congressional hearing use that. Another thing that jumped out at me just quickly was a couple quote unquote episodes back when they were describing the quote unquote unhinged meeting at the White House between Donald Trump and his, bananas council trying to come up with ways to get the states to seize the machinery of the elections. And there was this 10-minute passage where they told the story almost entirely with video clips and just brief interjections from whichever representative was leading that part of the testimony. And it was like an oral history. And I really felt like I'm not watching a congressional panel. I'm watching like a really well-produced true crime documentary on Netflix. This is how you tell that kind of story. And that was TV, and TV should be TV, or else it's not going to break through.
Well, and as you also point out, casting is crucial to all of this. These witnesses weren't anti-Trumpers. They weren't never Trumpers. They were, I mean, some of them were, sympathetic outsiders like the, Capitol police officers, but you had supporting characters. You had Bill Barr, calling Trump's conspiracy claims bullshit. Richard Donahue, who's been, was acting as Deputy Attorney General, was telling the story about telling Jeffrey Clark, "How about you go back to your office? We'll call you when there's an oil spill." I mean, it was spicy, and there were interesting and compelling characters developed.
Yeah. And the spiciness is important. That's, obviously people care about ideas, but people respond to incident and a great story and a voice. And when you're giving people sort of, these recurring characters like this, number one, again, it kind of, places you within this network of alliances and characters who are working against or with each other. And also it just creates that investment that you get when you're watching a TV show where it's like, oh, it's that guy. That guy's hilarious. I remember this guy. Oh, this guy. That guy's nuts. It's presenting people not just as like, dry figures in a Wikipedia entry, but as living characters who are making decisions that feel real and live and impactful.
And every show has to have a compelling lead. And do you think it's Liz Cheney?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Within the ensemble, She is your sort of, if you switch the analogy to being like a procedural or investigative TV show, she's like your Mulder and your Scully, or your detective in an episode of Law and Order. Kind of leading you through the proceedings, but also with, again, I was just impressed by the way she would drop these casual zingers that on the one hand were just sort of sick burns, like offhandedly the president was taking advice from an apparently inebriated Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah.
Okay, like now on one hand that's just funny, and good for you for taking your shot, but also, yeah, I don't know if this is conscious or subconscious, that's something that's going to get repeated on social media. That's something that's going to be, a lead quote in the stories the next day. That's something that's going to generate attention and get people talking. And that focuses attention on the sort of serious meat of your argument. And, there was sort of an element, I don't want to, say Liz Cheney is quote unquote Trumpian. But one thing we learned from Donald Trump is that there is an element of showmanship to politics, and that in the modern media environment, drawing attention is a powerful thing.
Well, speaking of showmanship, I think one of the more extraordinary episodes was last Thursday night when they kind of just threw it in, the running Josh Hawley meme, which they
Yes.
dropped in and then took a break. It felt like so social media could catch up, so that somebody could put the Benny Hill theme underneath Josh Hawley. But I mean, that was also an example of, we're going to throw this out here. It may not be strictly relevant to what we are doing, but this is going to create, this massive social media response. And I thought
Yeah.
that was certainly an interesting decision on their part.
It really felt like, okay, here's 10 minutes, go to work on it,
Yeah, that's right.
And the internet did. And there was just this sort of like, they didn't have to spotlight Josh Hawley, running through the hallway. But once you thought of it, how could you not do it? And again, I think that's an example where, okay, number one, it's just, it is a devastating dunk on Josh Hawley. There is sort of a point to it where it's also saying, he and people like him were playing footsie with this terrible force, and look what, came of it. But also, it's again sort of an element where you're giving the audience kind of the popcorn element that's going to provoke an emotional reaction or a laugh or whatever. And, that in turn helps underline or spread your more serious argument that, look, this vast network of people tried to throw out an American election.
So this was produced by James Goldston, former president of ABC News. And I thought it was interesting that you wrote that Goldston and the committee knew they had a thriller on their hands. I mean, you had conspiracy, backbiting, violence, even dark comedy, and they let it play like that on screen. And of course, the Josh Hawley being a pretty good example of that. So the hearings had that whole range of emotion, reading what you wrote. The hearings gave us both the tragedy of January 6th and the absurdity, the terror and the irony, the blood and the ketchup.
Yes.
I really thought that captured it. I mean, so you had this range. It wasn't all one note over and over again. I mean, I thought that was great. The blood and the ketchup, the terror and the irony. You had the absurdity, I mean, the outrage and the terror. And then you just had the pure insanity of it. So they had the kind of emotional narrative richness that you would expect from The Wire or Game of Thrones.
Yeah,
but was not usually a congressional hearing.
Right. Yeah, because it was they in simple terms, they recognized that their job was storytelling, and storytelling is not just entirely about data. You could imagine a version of this where somebody decided, why bother spending time on the anecdote about Donald Trump throwing a plate against the wall? What does that really do, about the larger charge? But number one, how can you not? And number two, it's these sort of character, emotional, just bananas, jaw-dropping moments. They are, in a kind of more indirect sense, creating this sense of an atmosphere of, a situation that was kind of out of control. And so I'd say, the ketchup does matter. We need our ketchup.
And the fact that we know what the reference is to the ketchup running down the wall. So, again, as you
Yeah.
wrote, this is summertime. People generally want to watch things like Stranger Things because they want to escape. But a lot of people still watch this. I mean, how do you describe the ratings? I mean, 17 million people, am I right about that? Watch that?
17 million for the second primetime one. I think it was a titch over 20 for the first one. Like,
Mhm.
it's not Super Bowl ratings,
Yeah. But these are
but
big.
it's
Yeah.
huge for summer TV. It's, bigger than, I am pretty sure, any scripted entertainment on TV now in an age of smaller ratings. I couldn't swear to this, but I think Yellowstone's the most popular scripted TV program now, and I don't think it draws 20 million overall for an episode. It's big.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. I bet it's a whole separate thing where in the history of TV audiences individually are just smaller than they used to be. But this is bigger than This Is Us. It's
Mhm.
bigger than anything except like NFL football.
Well, let's put this in context. I mean, we talk a lot about, Fox News, but, on any, given night, how many people are watching the Sean Hannity show?
I'm going to say Hannity. I couldn't, but Tucker, who I
Yeah.
think is their top
Mhm.
rated program now, three to four, something
Okay.
like that. And again, I'm not going to swear to that figure, but
Right.
it's in
But
that
it's
neighborhood.
in that
And that's the
range.
biggest thing on cable news. Yeah.
Right. So the biggest thing on cable news is 3 or 4 million. This was pulling 20 million, 17 million. I think that puts it in,
Yeah.
in context. So you close your review of the January 6th hearings, alluding to the famous, Army McCarthy hearings. And you closed with this line: the committee took its shot, told its story, and trusted we still had decency at long last. Of course, a reference to the famous quote, "At long last, have you no
Yeah.
decency, sir?" And that's the most memorable line of congressional hearings. This feels like it's more of sort of accumulation of facts, of lines, of imagery. There's no one line that's going to be like the Army McCarthy hearing that's going to be devastating, but there is that accumulation that seems to be taking some toll.
Yes, it's more the collection of this scene and this water cooler moment and that water cooler moment. And look, I think the easy thing to say is, oh, a hearing these days is not going to change politics night
Right.
and day. And yeah, obviously that's true. America is a different place than it was in the 1950s. The media environment is different. There isn't the same sort of social consensus or agreement on a shared set of facts. But within that, there are still people that are willing to listen to things. There are still ways of getting people's attention in ways that matter. And just like a TV network or producer that's trying to create a risky, ambitious show, with something like this, it's easy to talk yourself out of it and say, this stuff never quote unquote moves the needle anymore. At some point, you've got to decide, listen, if I think this is important, I got to trust that there's an audience out there that's going to listen to it and care about it. And we tell them what the stakes are, and they're going to decide, the stakes, the idea of America still having free democratic elections, that's something I'm going to care about enough to listen,
Okay.
and that was really their first step, that they trusted the audience.
So let's talk about how Donald Trump is seeing this. My sense is that even though there might be some people on the right who are trying to sneer and say this doesn't matter, that Donald Trump, who has lived his entire life, on television and watching television, that, well, tell me how he thinks about this, because I think he kind of gets the fact that this is a problem for him.
Trump knows television instinctively. Just one thing he has a gift at is knowing when something's breaking through and knowing the thing that's going to like grab people's attention. And you saw him responding in real
Yep.
time, for instance, to Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony. Whatever anybody else was going to say, he knew like this is something that's going to cut through. This is a figure that people are going to pay attention to and believe. And I got to step in. And throughout Donald Trump's presidency, he closely monitored the big TV events of his. He watched, Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings, and was sort of taking notes on like how well he thought he was, defending himself and so forth. So I think Trump has no illusion, that these hearings are not making a difference. I think he has seen them as a threat and as something that's gotten attention, and it may have. I think there's even been reporting on this. It influenced his toying with the idea of declaring for president at a certain time, or at least talking about declaring for president as a way of getting attention back. So I think he certainly sees that there is a threat and a battle for attention here.
He seemed to be triggered the most by Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony. And I have
Yeah.
to think, I try to think of this through the lens of how he's looking at this. And he has that obsession with people who look like they're from central casting. And I just had the sense that he's looking at her and her testimony, which was so compelling and so effective. And in many ways, this was a worst case scenario for him. I mean, that had to bother him a lot more than, say, Judge Michael Ludick.
You just think of, movies and TV shows that you've watched in the past and try to like look at this in the context of
Right.
that, young person who was working with a lot of more powerful older people and was kind of the fly on the wall and is taking a big risk as a young woman coming in and testifying. That is, and, just inherently, just in terms of Hollywood storytelling, a figure that people are going to
Yeah.
feel sympathy for. And Donald Trump was on a reality show for 14 seasons. He knows about casting. He knows about the idea that people see like a certain figure on TV and they take in just a few data points about them and they create a reaction. So yes, I think when he sees on her, he sees like this is a kind of person who could be very damaging to me.
Okay, so let's have a slight digression here because you also wrote a piece celebrating the 20th anniversary of what I think is the greatest television series ever, The Wire.
The Wire, yes.
And I have to say that The Wire spoiled me in a in a long-lasting way because it is so outstanding. And as you point out, it's been 2 decades, but its reputation's only grown bigger. I mean, it's one of those your point. It's one of those series like the original Star Trek that I think that people are going to have a hard time realizing. I actually was a little bit surprised to be reminded that originally it struggled with low ratings during its entire run. But
Yeah.
you asked the question: has anyone made another Wire since? I mean, really? I mean, what made that so distinctive? And put it in some context about how extraordinary that series was.
For starters, yes, you're right. It never had good ratings, and its reputation has grown since it aired. But, part of the thing was that it was doing something that was, difficult at the time, and it's been difficult to do since, which is to, create a cop show that wasn't just about, neatly solving, a case of the week, but is more in the matter of like a Balzac novel or something, trying to create this giant canvas of a society and a city and just show every part of what makes things run. And to tell a story that has like a lot of fascinating characters, but isn't really about, superheroic characters who have the power to change their destiny. A lot of what The Wire was about was, systems are really powerful and it can be really hard to beat them. And it's tough to kind of make that kind of systemic storytelling into entertaining storytelling. And the Wire pulled that off really well. Honestly, the handful of shows that I can think that have tried to do similar things since then have often been by people who were involved with The Wire. David Simon's subsequent shows, Treme, The Deuce. It's still 20 years later. If you made that 20 years later, that would still be a risky TV show to make.
Well, I remember watching it and thinking, I have no idea what's going to happen. I have no idea. And also the complexity of it. I think that was also the fact that, as you described it, as realistic and meticulously messy. And
Yeah.
also, there were no simple answers there. I mean, you weren't convinced that they made much of a difference, if the cases got solved at all. But you said it was not like cable dramas like The Sopranos that were built around charismatic anti-heroes. So how do you compare and contrast The Wire with The Sopranos, which, by the way, I have not yet seen. So
Oh, well,
I'm saving
I
it for my
recommend
old
it.
age. No, I know.
Yeah.
I haven't. I'm saving it for. But how is it different?
A show like The Sopranos is sort of in the model of, it's focused on a compelling central character, Tony Soprano, who is in many ways, the master of his destiny. He makes decisions and they affect the larger story. People, support him or they fight against him, but they're reacting to it. It's sort of, to like put it in social science terms, it's like the great man theory of history. The
Yeah.
idea that there's just this one person can have grand effects on his world. And yeah, the Wire was, it was an entertaining story of people doing things, cops performing these painstaking investigations and the wars within drug gangs and political maneuverings at City Hall. There was a lot of exciting action going on, but it was really a story about futility. Ultimately, a lot of it was, the first season is kind of about, we put in, all these hours in this intense investigation to take down a drug kingpin, and here we go, and we did it, and the drugs are still getting sold. And it was just like you were just sweeping back a wave on the beach with a broom. And that's just a big difference.
Yeah. Well, and also, as you point out, it's not really a cop show. I mean,
Yeah.
it opened the door that other cop shows didn't enter. I mean, labor, education, media criticism, and each one of the episodes was. Remember when the one scene when the new mayor is sitting around there talking about fixing the schools, and I think it lasts about 30 seconds. Somebody says, "No, we can't do anything about it. I mean, we don't want to go into those depths," and that's it. There's just that's it. They just decide they're not going to do anything about the schools. Or when Omar is killed and they're sitting around the newsroom and the news story comes up, and what I think it gets cut, right? It's like one paragraph and he doesn't even make the newspaper. I actually thought that was one of the most realistic portrayals of a newsroom that I have ever seen.
Yeah, I agree, and kind of makes the point that this vast story that you have been just deeply invested in for 5 seasons is just a ripple in the larger world. That was that was really kind of understatedly devastating.
James Poniewozik, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. I appreciate it. The book is Audience of One: Trump Television and the Fracturing of America, which has aged very well. I think it has stood up to the test of the last few years very, very well. And of course, you can read James's work in the New York Times. Your piece on the January 6th hearings is Water Cooler TV, I think, is a must read. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much, Charlie. I had a lot of fun.
The Bulwark podcast is produced by Katie Cooper with audio production by Jonathan Siri. I'm Charlie Sykes. Thank you for listening to today's Bulwark podcast, and we'll be back tomorrow. We'll do this all over again.
You loved Lala Kent on Vanderpump Rules. Now get to know her on Give Them Lala.
With her assistant, Jess.
Last night, Lisa wanted to clean out the fridge. And I was like, I can't lift anything. I'm not helping.
Number one, Lala was told she can't lift anything, you guys. So it's not like she's just like, I'm not lifting anything.
No, but I'm not helping. But even my friends know. I'll write you a check. I'll do some Venmo. I'll have something wired. I am not helping. I don't like it.
Give Them Lala. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.